Member for Oak Bay Gordon Head.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. Thank you, Honourable Speaker. Please let me start by acknowledging the remarks and thoughtful remarks they were from the member of West Kelowna. I hope to be addressing some of the concerns he raised as in the process of him outlining some of the issues from his particular riding and some of the concerns he received, which were similar to some that I received. I also want to acknowledge the talk from the member from the Sunshine Coast, Powell River Sunshine Coast, who I also saw who brought some important information to this debate. In this debate, Honourable Speaker, I'll say to start, I'm the designated speaker on this issue. I'm not going to be too long, but I will probably go just beyond the half-hour mark. I'm going to outline my comments in a number of ways in a format that starts with a broad introduction as to what I would argue is a crisis here in terms of affordability in British Columbia. Then I'll follow up with that with a little bit of a discussion about how the speculation tax was rolled out. I think my comments will jive with some of the comments made by the member from West Kelowna. In particular, I'll highlight some statements made in the messaging early on, some of the subsequent changes that occurred leading up to the actual legislation being introduced. Then I'll move, Honourable Speaker, in my address to discuss some of the concerns I've raised consistently under, such as treating Canadians, equally, as well as the concerns I've had with respect to meaningful consultation with local governments. Some of the concerns I've had with the ability of some strata, for example, or some districts that have no rental or no secondary suite or the tourist commercial zoning, so you can't actually, even if you wanted to, rent out your unit because of existing laws, legislation, or bylaws. Then I'll talk a little bit about some of the land under development issue, an issue that I spent a good deal of time on as the member from Kelowna West raised, specifically with respect to the uncertainty that this created in the development sector. Some of the other issues I raised was the impacts on British Columbians who frankly aren't speculators. And I'll go through a number of personal stories, Honourable Speaker. They'll move then towards the whole issue of reaching this agreement with respect to amendments that I'll be putting forward with government and trying to address how those came about to provide a public record of the process. And then finally, I'll conclude, what I believe is critical, is the need for ongoing monitoring of actually what's being implemented to ensure that we are not, as legislators, overly interfering in the market, to ensure, rather that we ensure that the purpose of this tax, which fundamentally is to recognize that leaving homes vacant in a market that is with zero vacancy, creates a social externality that should be internalized somehow to those leaving the properties vacant until such time as vacancy rates get improve. So to the introduction of the housing crisis, without any doubt in my mind, there are a number of communities where affordability has reached crisis proportions, and those are predominantly the urban centres in our province. In particular, the region in Victoria, Kelowna, Vancouver is the poster child of this issue, and Nanaimo. This is a crisis facing an entire generation of millennials who literally cannot find a place to rent, who literally cannot afford a place to purchase, who are struggling to actually, live anywhere near where they can work, and we're seeing a generation starting to move away. We just had the community of move into Oak Bay, a tent community just yesterday, of homeless people in Victoria who cannot get a place to live, and this is an issue that's moving around the province. We've got talking to business, a crisis in terms of attracting and retaining highly skilled workers. If you talk to those in the tech sector, the single biggest issue for the tech sector is attraction and retention of highly skilled workers. They cannot pay the salaries that other jurisdictions are paying, yet the cost of living is gone through the roof. This isn't a problem in parts of British Columbia. There's no doubt that some parts of British Columbia, this isn't an issue. But it's certainly in some of our urban issues, affordability has reached crisis levels. We know offshore money that has been flowing into our market, both in terms of speculation as well as through some nefarious activities that the Attorney General has been looking at, needs to be dealt with. But I've always argued that in doing so, in trying to treat the issue of foreign capital coming into British Columbia, we need to be sure that we protect Canadians and British Columbians. Now, the government's approach was to introduce something called a speculation tax initially. It's now changed, and I'm actually pleased, Honourable Speaker, with the change of the name. I think it's far more appropriate. It's now called a speculation and vacancy tax. The vacancy component is critical because the speculation component, in my view, largely applies to the offshore money. We wouldn't have done this. I've already pointed out that the approach of our party would have been to bring in place a New Zealand-style approach to actually say that, you know what, if you want to own property in our nation, in our jurisdiction, you must be paying taxes here. This is what New Zealand does. This is what Australia does. This is what many European countries does. The idea here, of course, is that we are not living in a free market for investment in real estate and land. You and I cannot, Honourable Speaker, buy a home in New Zealand. We cannot buy a home in Denmark. We cannot buy a home on the coast of Mexico. We cannot buy a home in Australia. And the idea here, of course, is that these other jurisdictions have recognized that when there are small local population centers and 7 billion people in the world, the influence of external capital on small domestic markets can be profound. And this happened in British Columbia. So our approach was to be different from what the government have approached. We wanted to initiate that ban on foreign purchase. When I say foreign, it doesn't matter what passport you own, it means where you're living and paying taxes. Now, we're not government. There are 3 BC Green MLAs in this legislature representing the views of, well, at least that got elected by 17% of the popular vote in British Columbia. We recognize that in not forming government, we are not able to actually initiate a ban, New Zealand style, on foreign capital flow. But we certainly supported, and I have certainly supported all the way through government's efforts to deal with some of the aspects of foreign money coming in, whether it be through the dealing with money laundering, whether it be through the foreign buyers tax, and more importantly, dealing with the issue of satellite families. Now, satellite families are defined in this legislation, and we'll be exploring that further at committee stage. These are families where you might have one person in the family working elsewhere, paying all their taxes elsewhere, living in, say, Point Grey or Oak Bay, or Vancouver Quilchena, living in a $5 million home and declaring taxable income of $20, accessing our healthcare system, accessing our social services, accessing our education system, but paying taxes in other jurisdictions which are not declared here in British Columbia. To me, Honourable Speaker, this so-called satellite family is actually, again, not the cost of them actually being part of our society and living in these homes is not being internalized. The taxes are paid elsewhere, but the benefits are collected here. And so the government's approach here, I wholeheartedly, and I have done so since day one, this is dealing with the so-called satellite family. Over the months, I pointed out numerous concerns to government. This decision we came today to introduce 3 amendments was not something that was taken lightly. I saw this legislation for the first time when it was introduced. Life has been such a blur with these, like burning the midnight oil. Could have been yesterday or the day before now. It's just been one big, long blur in terms of negotiation. But when it was first introduced, I saw this, and I was pleased with some of the additions. One of these additions, one of these critical additions, was identified by the member from West Kelowna. As the member from West Kelowna pointed out, when government first introduced this speculation tax, I would argue the details had not been thought through. And one of those critical details was, what about development of land? What about if you have accumulated some land and you're going to build townhouses and condos to sell to British Columbians, to Canadians, and that in doing so you're waiting for permits, you're waiting to actually ensure that you get construction built, it takes a few years. That is not speculation, Honourable Speaker. And I am absolutely thrilled after meeting with the UDI, developers in Vancouver, in Kelowna, and all across BC, bringing these concerns directly to government. The government listened, and government has actually included in here exemption during the development of land of a speculation tax. That was critical. I suspect some, but not all, of the correspondence that the member from West Kelowna had with respect to uncertainty and construction on hold is a direct consequence of the uncertainty, and we have now seen certainty. And I agree with the member from West Kelowna. It would have been awfully nice if, when the tax was first implemented or announced back in March, that the certainty had been given to market. Because I, like the member from West Kelowna, believe that market uncertainty is not a good thing, because you have projects going on hold. You have projects potentially walking. You have people then speculating on the uncertainty. So I completely agree there, but I am pleased that this has been dealt with. Not all the concerns have been dealt with. Not everything has been addressed. And I spent, after seeing this bill come out, and I'll come to some of the things that have been addressed, many, many hours. My staff spent many, many hours trying to actually get to a fundamental position where we could actually support the overarching structure of this bill, recognizing that there's still work that needs to be done, and I'll also identify some of those things. And there is time to fix some of these things. In my view, good government works when people work together. I recognize that it's a much more difficult position for official opposition. And I recognize that when this government now is in opposition, it's more difficult for official opposition to actually constructively work with government because of the setup we have in our legislative structure. As a third party, a small third party, we have a duty and a responsibility to British Columbians to be responsible with the so-called power, the so-called influence that we have. And that duty and responsibility is to ensure that we listen and communicate our concerns and do what we can through collaboration and compromise to come to a situation, to come to development of good legislation, to policy that we think tempers some of what was introduced and reflects some of the concerns, but not all, but allows us to support the policy moving forward with the recognition that this is not what we would have done, Honourable Speaker. This is not what we have done. So what happened with the speculation tax and the budget rollout? Again, the member from West Kelowna articulated this quite well. When it was first announced, nobody knew the details. I didn't know the details. The member from West Kelowna didn't know the details. In fact, government suggested to the media, the Premier suggested, that British Columbians were fully exempt from the tax. I thought they were fully exempt from the tax. In fact, my constituency office, Honourable Speaker, sent out email assuring my constituents and those who contacted me that British Columbians were exempt from the tax based on the information I received directly from listening to the Premier. Well, you know, you can imagine I was a little bit surprised when I read Vaughan Palmer's article pointing out that I was sending out incorrect information. And he was right. And I acknowledged he was right. He was right in that an information bulletin had been put out that was inconsistent with the messaging and the language that had been said by government. This is not good for certainty. This was, quite frankly, from my perspective, somewhat embarrassing. I don't like to send out wrong information. We did our best to connect it, to do that, and we, at that point, realized that we're going to have to spend a lot of time on this file. We started pushing government to fix some things. We recognized that the issue of the housing crisis is not a rural issue. It is largely an urban issue. So in that, you'll see that, for example, we pushed to get some of these islands out. Like, there were islands in the Nanaimo Regional District which was excluded. Nanaimo's islands that had no electricity and no power and no rental market, which were included because what was done in the metrics to determine it, they were used basically over broad regional districts instead of over urban areas. So what we were able to do is to get government to focus this initially on the urban areas where there is more of a problem. Some areas like the Salt Spring Island do have rental issues. However, it's a very complex issue there as well, and ongoing work with the Rental Task Force, I understand, and my good colleague here from Senator Northern Islands will be discussing that, I'm sure, when he speaks to this bill. There are issues that still need to be worked out. In March, government announced a few changes that it had made. These included reducing the rates for British Columbians and Canadians, ensuring in particular that the tax didn't apply to rural and vacation areas. One of the issues, again, this was very relevant to the member from Chilliwack, Kent, I believe it is now, Cultus Lake. In the initial version, Cultus Lake was included. I think Harrison Hot Springs may have been included as well. And again, these we pointed out in going, I directly took the emails from your constituents, I'm sure you probably did as well, took them directly, do not pass go to government, saying, look, how does it make sense for Cultus Lake, which is not an urban center, for Harrison Hot Springs to actually be included in a speculation tax when their markets are quite different from, say, South Surrey or Tsawwassen or Burnaby or Nanaimo or Victoria. And so government did remove much of the rural aspects and focused on the urban. And that was signaled out in March. But even since then, I pointed out that I'm struggling because the speculation tax was first introduced in the budget. I've heard scores of stories of individual cases over the last 8 months or so of people who've asked, am I included? Am I not included? Am I here? Am I not there? What does this mean? And this, this took a lot of work, honestly, Honourable Speaker. It took a lot of work to try to put together a detailed understanding of the complexity of this issue, of the complexity of what government was trying to accomplish with the introduction of a tax that essentially says that we want to create an internalization of that externality associated with leaving vacant property in areas that have low vacancy rates. And so many of these examples were brought forward. Many meetings were had. But the issue, of course, was that we didn't know to what extent government was listening. We didn't know to what extent government was listening until this bill was actually introduced sometime in the last 72 hours, which have been a complete blur to me based on the fact that, when was it? Was it on Tuesday? Thank you. This was introduced on Tuesday. When it was rolled out, when this came out, I was, as I mentioned, glad to see that government had listened in many, but not all examples. For examples, there was exemptions for people who obviously should not be hit, where being hit with the tax would cause significant financial hardship. Some of the specific cases I raised to government were included. For example, people who own a second home in a city because they need medical treatment. There are people in British Columbia who have to go and own a home in a particular area because they're required for medical reasons to come and report periodically to that area. They've been exempted. People who have secondary suites, for example, if you're in the community of Kelowna West and you live in Alberta and use your home in the summer, but if you have a secondary suite in your property, Honourable Speaker, that secondary suite would grant exemption for the entire property. This isn't without its own problems. For example, Honourable Speaker, in the municipality or the district of Oak Bay, where I am from, where I represent rather. The district does not allow secondary suites. So there's some issues there that we still need to canvass. Government listened in terms of examples brought forward about couples who own two homes. One home is where one spouse works, one home is where the other spouse works. They don't work in the same city, but they're still together, and it seemed outrageous to penalize married or partners who happen to come together and formally, take vows and commit to marriage, to penalize them because they had two properties, one of which was being used by one spouse and one by the other. Government listened. The issue of strata properties, areas zoned tourist commercial, where you can't rent out places. Again, government listened. Lands that are vacant or under development. Again, government listened. I'm pleased that the UDI, whom I met with numerous times on this file, Anne McMillan recently said when they saw the legislation that they were pleased that government committed today that they will exempt lands under development from this tax. So the UDI is actually pleased, and this is a very, very important exemption, because we cannot actually address affordability if we start passing on a speculation tax to purchasers of condos and townhouses, which were actually being built for affordability purposes. So it's good government lesson there. But you know, there's still issues and to deal with. Let me go through a few personal stories first, because I think it's important, Honourable Speaker, to get a sense of some of the issues that I'm going to canvass more extensively in committee stage. Committee stage, Honourable Speaker, as is known in this House, is critical for us to get interpretation of this legislation for broader application. There are some real subtleties as to how this tax will be introduced that government obviously has yet to capture. You know, in a briefing we had on introduction of tax plus some hours in 72. Again, it's been a blur. I was asking some of the issues directly in the briefing. It's clear that government has attempted a common sense approach not to harm people who are not speculating. However, there are going to be examples that have yet to be dealt with. I mean, I can think of one example that needs to be discussed where you, for no reason other than you've actually got a house that's old, your house happens to be built on 2 city lots, that you, in terms of the registration of your city lots, you have one house, but there's 2 lots. It doesn't make a lot of sense to pay a spec tax because 100 years ago the lot zoning was such the way it was. So there are some oddities there where we have to look out. I don't know to what extent there are other jurisdictions out there where boundaries of actual lots span multiple zones. For example, there are houses in Oak Bay that have some of their property is in Oak Bay, part of the property is in Victoria. Now, to what extent does that exist in the province of British Columbia on the edges of the areas covered? And I'm sure there are properties in Nanaimo, in the CRD, in Kelowna West, elsewhere, where most of the property is in the contained area, but some of it isn't. These are issues that government may have not yet thought through and hopefully will be canvassed during committee stage to get some clarification. You know, I've had people who've own a house, strata buildings, which doesn't allow rentals, contact me. You know, I've had people who've invested in Victoria in places that are zoned tourist commercial, specifically designed for short-term rentals. The zoning actually requires short-term rentals, doesn't allow long-term rentals. And again, this was partly dealt with in this legislation, Honourable Speaker, essentially by saying that in the affected years 2018 and 2019, these areas, tourist commercial type zoning or stratas with no rental clause, are not going to be subject. I still have issues there with respect to secondary suites in municipalities that don't allow secondary suites officially to be zoned. Can you officially declare a secondary suite when officially you're not allowed to have one? There's issues there that I hope to canvass. I'm hoping, Honourable Speaker, and I'm hoping that my good friend from the riding of Vancouver West End and also my good friend from the riding of Saanich North and the Islands will be thinking about the issue of stratas and actually whether or not we in British Columbia are getting close to getting to where Ontario already is. You know, Honourable Speaker, in Ontario, you cannot actually have a no rental clause, long-term rental clause in a strata. Strata is empowered with the power of eviction. That's important. But you're no longer, you can say, and it's been tested in court, no short-term rentals, but you cannot say and you cannot own property and put a no rental clause on it. I'm hoping that, you know, this committee takes a good hard look at that because it is an issue. It's an important issue. If you're going to apply a speculation tax to somebody because they're not renting it out, but the strata has said you can't rent it out, there's 2 components here that are important. One, there's a real investment opportunity here for British Columbia. If we're able to invest in new construction in strata units that allow rental, there's an ability to attract capital to our province to create new investment. But secondly, there's a lot of stock in the market that which potentially could be sold if people are a friend of this speculation tax that would otherwise not be sold and would be rented out. So it's win-win-win if we start to think about this in greater detail. You know, one of the other issues I've had emails on, Honourable Speaker, is there's been issues with respect to transition of home ownership. I've had couples who own 2 homes in the midst of trying to sell one and move to another. One example was a constituent. They had a house in Surrey, moving to Saanich, actually the housing crisis in our area is largely associated with people saying, I can cash in the Metro Vancouver region and get a lot more over here and live well thereafter. This particular family had a house in Surrey and one in Saanich. They wanted to move, both areas subject to a spec tax. They were concerned that in trying to sell their home, that they would be subject to a spec tax on one of their homes. Well, in fact, here we have that transition clause, which I think is important to canvass further in committee stage, but does address this particular issue. I've had similar ones with a couple coming from Kelowna. To moving to Victoria. Again, same thing. We seem to get a lot of people coming to Victoria to retire, and they live in other parts of BC, and they're really worried about selling a home in one place and buying it in another, and that transition amount is actually critical there. And we're seeing that legislation brought forward in what we were shown on Tuesday. Couple of people have told me similar stories about from the Kootenays buying in Victoria to retire here. They recently bought. They're worried that they'll be hit by a speculation tax. Their child is actually living in the home now, but they're worried that they'll be subject to this. Again, there's issues here. That almost sounded like a fire alarm, Honourable Speaker. There are issues here with there are issues here with respect to whether or not that arm's length or non-arm's length allowance of the son living in a house while the son might be attending University of Victoria, for example, while they're planning to return out, whether that was considered speculation or not. Turns out, again, people like this have some coverage as per the legislation. Again, we have to canvass this further in committee stage. One of the most profound issues brought to me was Canadians saying that this is not fair. I am being taxed at a different rate living in Ontario compared to living in BC. And why is it that the rate is 1% for me being in Ontario and 0.5% for me being in BC? You know, Honourable Speaker, this one really struck at heart. I'm a Canadian first, I'm a British Columbian second, and third, I am actually a person from the city of Oak Bay Gordon Head, if it's a city, riding of Oak Bay Gordon Head. We are all Canadians, and to me it's critical, and through our party it was critical that we treat Canadians equally. And one of the issues here that was really took you know, midnight oils being burnt was working with government to ensure that they recognize that the tax rate for British Columbians and Canadians, making that difference was simply not acceptable. You know, this again will not deal with all of the issues raised by the member from West Kelowna, but I can say when it goes down from 1% to 0.5%, that actually affects a lot of decision making for people that I know who have homes in West Kelowna but may live in Alberta and spend 4 months of the year there. The 0.5% makes a significant difference in terms of the amount that one would pay. It's not perfect. It's not what we would do, Honourable Speaker, but it's significantly less than it would otherwise be. And one could argue, as government does, is what it's doing is while it's still encouraging development through this exemption of land under development, at the same time it's saying that, you know what, there's an external social cost to developing property that is vacant that needs to be internalized by those who leave the property vacant. And that external cost now is not differentiated between, the rate is not differentiated between British Columbians and other Canadians. That is one of the amendments that I am working now with legislative drafters that we've kindly been given access to through this government to ensure is brought forward at committee stage for this bill. I agreed with these Canadians that they paid taxes. They may not have paid taxes in BC, but they paid taxes in Canada. I have a problem, Honourable Speaker, with the way the taxation system is in Canada, and we can come to this more in question period, I'm sure we will. Right now, we know, Honourable Speaker, that a lot of people retire in British Columbia. Part of the reasons why we have an affordability crisis is we are the destination of choice in Canada for retirement. Honourable Speaker, if you look at the amount of money spent as a function of age in the healthcare system, it's also really clear that you spend more as people get closer and closer to the end of their life. The older they are, the more you cost the healthcare system. So we also know that the demographic of places like Vancouver Island and BC as a whole is older than other jurisdictions in Canada. So people are paying taxes in other jurisdictions and accessing our healthcare system here, but our Canada Health Transfer does not recognize the age. It is not weighted by age. Our Canada Health Transfer shorts British Columbia to the tune of $200 to $300 million based on a simple calculation that we should be getting age-weighted cost transfers, not per person cost. Had we been getting $200 to $300 million more in healthcare transfers under the Canada Health Act, we'd have $200 to $300 more we could put directly into healthcare, which means $200 to $300 more million not coming out of other budgets and going into healthcare, which means we could have been spending $200 to $300 million more in affordability housing and housing every single year. Honourable Speaker, this needs to be dealt with, and this is something we will continue to push on in the years ahead. I've had lots of people contact me. I have a good deal of sympathy for the member of West Kelowna. I've had a good deal of his constituents contact me as well. I understand some of the issues are there, and he's put us in a very difficult position. And we've done many, many hours of trying to ensure that we actually we reflect the values that we've been trying to instill, that Canadians are treated equally, that I'll come back to the mayors are consulted, as well as that money stays in the local community. You know, Honourable Speaker, there's examples I've been given of a professor. There's two professors in a family. They're not hurting financially, but one professor works at UBC, one professor works at UBC Okanagan. And they have two places, and they were both initially living in one place, and the other would have been treated as spec tax, and they were getting very confused. Now we have a recognition that with certain married couples, that there's an exemption for them. I mean, again, I had a very compelling email just today, Honourable Speaker, just today from a woman whose family home is in Surrey. Yet this woman was a teacher who worked in downtown Vancouver. This family home in Surrey had her elderly mother staying in it. She didn't want to sell it. Clearly it was in her name. But she had a condo in Vancouver because she couldn't fathom that commute every day to teach in the elementary school or the school system in Vancouver. And so she stayed in the condo during the work week and lived with her mother in her home on the weekends and during the summer. The question is, would she be covered under a spec tax? I'm virtually certain, based on the exemptions that have been put here, based on government listening to the numerous feedbacks that have been given to it, that they will not be covered. They are exempt. And again, I'll explore that story in detail during committee stage. I could go on and on with other stories, but I think Honourable Speaker, you've got the point that, in fact, there are many examples, secondary suites that can't be listened to, that have to be dealt with, and so on, so forth. The stories are endless. And again, I'm sure other members opposite will provide more stories. I believe the member from Chilliwack-Kent is maybe speaking very shortly, and I'm sure he has similar stories to offer as well. The concerns I've had coming back to this issue that have not been addressed in this bill as of now, I have highlighted on an ongoing basis over the past 8 months. These are, this bill does not deal with flipping. It still doesn't deal with somebody who buys a home, leaves it vacant for 9 months, flips it out. They'll have to pay a capital gain. Buys another home, flips it out. We're not dealing with flipping here. So we're going to continue to actually have do what we can to ensure that this aspect of speculation is actually looked at. We're collecting data now in British Columbia in terms of the pre-sale of condos offshore. Again, we're not dealing with some of the aspects of pre-sale flipping as well. There is some that can occur. Now, I know that members opposite, the leader of the official opposition, introduced a private members bill that would require the flipping of a pre-sales condo. If you actually did that you'd have to report 50% of the actual profit as income. I mean, that, Honourable Speaker, with respect to the Leader of Opposition, isn't going to do anyone any good, because essentially that bill says if you're going to break the law, you shouldn't, because you already have to declare 100% of that flipping income as a capital gain. So this isn't dealing with the actual issue. We need to have realistic solutions. And that is the difficult position we've been put in as three members, a small three-member caucus, working in between two large parties, one which is government, one which is not, is that we see our role as working to ensure that government policy is better, at the same time as doing what we can to continue to move forward this issue, to deal with some of the real aspects of speculation. Government has taken some steps with respect to hidden ownership to get at trust ownership, beneficial ownership, get at corporate ownership. We frankly don't think they've done it as aggressively as it should be done. We know that government has taken steps to actually deal with potential money from nefarious activity entering real estate. We don't think they've done it fast enough. We've been pushing for more progressive action on no rental clauses, with, of course, the provision that the power of eviction be granted to strata. You know, government, we think, also needs to ensure that people know that they're dealing with a common sense approach in this legislation. We haven't given up on this. There is, in the briefing that I had yesterday, plus some hours between the last little while, one of the questions we asked is, what is the intention? You've made these changes, why these ones and not these ones? The information I got, which we hope to explore further in committee stage, was that government is trying to take a common sense approach to ensure that most people who are just regular people are not captured by this speculation and vacancy tax. But it's really targeting the overall goal of affordability, which is when you leave homes vacant for no other reason, you're creating an externality, a social cost that is going to be partially internalized. So we know one of the things that it does exist here is in the legislation there is an appeals process that exists, but again, appeals process that aren't publicly kind of brought forward, aren't communicated, aren't demonstrated, will not be known about. So we're pushing to ensure that the public understands that they may have certain criteria that government hasn't actually realized exists. The one I just gave an example of is a property that may strata two regions. I'm sure there are some, because there are properties in Oak Bay where half the house is in Oak Bay and the other half is in Victoria. Go figure that one, Honourable Speaker, but they exist. There must be properties on the boundaries of some of these urban areas that have similar issues. There must be a mechanism that people know that they can bring these issues forward and get a response in a timely fashion, subject to the common sense kind of approach of ensuring that regular people are not being hurt. One of the second factors is that wasn't covered in this. So with that said, after reading this bill, after going through many months, I mean, this Honourable Speaker has been not just one or two meetings, it has been months. I'm sure, again, the member from West Kelowna, as somebody who's quite passionate on this file, has also spent many, many hours on this file too. After many, many hours seeing this legislation, in my view, in our view as a caucus, it still needed to go further. It still needed to go further in three more ways. Over the past number of months, inspired by those myriad stories in my inbox and the many conversations, both with people in industry, with homeowners, from mayors of affected areas, I've consistently raised the concerns with government's proposed approach to the speculation tax. In particular, Honourable Speaker, I say it again, I had these three critical areas. The first is that need for local governments to have a more significant role in determining what happens in their communities. The second is the fact that Canadians should not be paying higher rates than British Columbians. The third is the need to limit the unfair impacts on Canadian homeowners who are not speculators. So again, these have come through the myriad stories, the hard work, the thank the constituents, the other British Columbians, the member from Kelowna West, and all of those people who emailed from across Canada for their input on this. And I do regret, and I agree again with the member from West Kelowna, that the uncertainty that has been created has not been helpful for the investment in Kelowna. Has not been helpful for investment in the Capital Regional District. However, I think today we have certainty. We have certainty in the legislation in terms of the land being developed. We have certainty in terms of our support for this legislation subject to government supporting the 3 amendments we're going to bring forward. And we have certainty in allowing us to move forward. So let me come to the 3 amendments, and I'll speak to each of these in detail that I'll be bringing forward. The first amendment requires mayors from affected municipalities to be part of an annual review process with the Minister of Finance. Now, at cynical first look, you might think that that amendment is just saying minister has to meet with mayors. That is not the intent of the amendment. The amendment will be far more thorough than that. While I would have, and I've publicly said I would have preferred to have a local government opt-out automatically, we would have done that. That would have been our approach. We brought that into conversations. I recognize that that would have given the mayors and communities a clear channel to making a case based on evidence, as the member from West Kelowna has done with the commissioned report that they have from West Kelowna. That evidence would have been able to show how tax applied to their communities. And we would have then allowed them to opt out. But what we've done instead is say, okay, government, you say you know best. We understand where you're coming from. You have the same shared value. But we critically believe that you need to ensure that you have metrics, affordability metrics, rental vacancy metrics that you actually put together in a meeting with mayors every year to ensure that the ongoing application of the speculation tax is done through consultation with data, with evidence, with mayors annually. So it's not just about a meeting, it's also about the metrics that must be brought and argued at a meeting. And we're grateful that we've got the full support of Minister on that. So that comes from a case where no such, other than informal meetings, were going to occur, and that was the position of government, to our position where we wanted a full-out opt-out, and that was where we ended up. Now, why the role for local government is critically important is that, and why the annual review process must ensure government is looking at community impacts and considering whether vacancy and affordability metrics within affected communities warrant the removal of the tax. Why this is so important is that communities know best what is in their best interests. I recognize now is an odd time for this discussion in light of the civic elections occurring in 2 days, but once the dust settles from those civic elections, it's critical that mayors and new councils or incumbents actually have informed discussions with government, informed by metrics that are relevant to their communities. So, Honourable Speaker, the second amendment that I put forward here is a requirement and a recognition that we did not want this to become a tax grab, basically a central government tax grab for broad, undefined housing affordability issues. We felt that if you're going to go and have money raised in a community, in the community of Nanaimo, in the community of Kelowna or West Kelowna, that money needs to stay in that community. That money should not flow back to revenue of government coffers. And in fact, that money, the reason and the justification for this tax is in essence an internalization of that externality, that social externality caused by the preponderance of vacant properties. It's important that you use that revenue in a neutral fashion to actually offset and deal with the affordability issue. And we're pleased to come to an agreement on that issue, in that while there was broad recognition that in this legislation it will go to broad affordability measures, here it's very specifically in the amendment that we'll bringing forward go to direct affordability issues in the communities from which the money arose. The final amendment, Honourable Speaker, that's being worked through right now will be to equalize the rates that Canadians and British Columbians pay. It's saying that if you're a British Columbian or a Canadian or other Canadian You're Canadian first. You're all paying the 0.5%. Again, this is an important issue of fairness from my perspective. Punishing Canadians in a differential way like that didn't seem to be fair. Again, we know that this will meet in some of the exchanges I've had with people across Canada. People don't mind, again, recognizing that there is an externality there that they can internalize with the small, extra additional tax. They recognize that. They recognize they're not paying, provincial taxes here, perhaps. And they don't mind paying a little bit more. And I've got examples where people have said that. However, they do mind egregiously being charged twice the rate as British Columbians, because they ultimately are Canadians first. And we agreed with them. And government didn't want to move on this, Honourable Speaker. Government did not want to move on this. And this took a lot of work, Honourable Speaker, and this amendment is actually being supported by government, but it's not without government, essentially having to compromise on the intent of this, because the government came into this very much trying to differentiate between those who live and pay taxes in BC and those who live and come to BC. And we felt it was important to treat Canadians the same. Again, coming back to that, this bill is not how I would have approached the issue. It's not how the BC Green Caucus would approach the issue. But with the amendments that we're bringing forward and the work that has been done by government to limit the impacts of this tax on Canadians who are not speculating, I feel at this stage, subject to the approval of those amendments, I'll be supporting this legislation. There are still key elements of this bill, such as implementing the tax on satellite families and foreign owners who do not pay income tax in BC, that I've always believed are critical to support. In fact, the government, I don't believe, has gone far enough. We need to crack down, Honourable Speaker, on foreign money flowing into our real estate market, pushing housing far beyond the reach of ordinary Canadians. There's 4.5 million people in British Columbia. There's 7 billion people in the world. There's an awful lot of capital out there looking to park itself as an investment in this province in real estate solely for the purpose of speculation. And we think that actually here in our caucus, we think that needs to be clamped down on even more than is being done. The components of the tax that deal with foreigners and satellite families, Honourable Speaker, always supported that. And we believe that this will have a significant impact, as articulated in this bill, in terms of dealing with this issue. With that said, Honourable Speaker, one of the key aspects of this legislation, is we need to have ongoing and continual, rigorous monitoring of what is going on in the housing market. My worry, Honourable Speaker, is we all know the issue of supply and demand. Right now, we know that there is not a lot of supply in the rental market. In fact, there's very little supply in the rental market. We have begun to see increasing supply in some of these urban areas in the market for sale. We've started to see a softening of demand in some of these areas, not so much at the low end, but at the high end of the market. Softening of demand. The very careful step and monitoring that needs to be done as we move forward is to ensure that in a time of reduced demand, we don't suddenly initiate a massive influx of supply, because that can lead to market instability. What I mean by that is, we've got to ensure that the communication to those people who are being exempted here, communications to those people about the importance of an appeal process, about the importance about a process to ensure that situations that may not have been thought through can still be addressed, to people who are in no rental clauses, the communication to them that there is 2 years and government has 2 years to get to the bottom of this, for people who are in tourist commercial zoning to recognize that there's still 2 years to come to play before government has to fix this. This needs to be communicated on so we don't see people rushing to sell properties out of lack of knowledge of what this legislation is actually doing. Because at a time of decreasing demand and slightly increasing supply, if you put in a bunch of supply, it's troubling. So I'm pleased in the discussions and the technical briefing we had with respect to this bill, the government is committed to doing this ongoing monitoring, and the ministry staff are committed to doing this this ongoing monitoring. And I too will be watching the market closely and how this tax affects the market closely in the months ahead. My hope is that the amendments will give us some tools to ensure local governments have a clear role in a review process on an annual basis, to ensure that we're having evidence flow into the decision-making going forward, to ensure that uncertainty is removed from actually this decision-making process, to ensure that we actually can move back towards a situation where developers in Kelowna, in Victoria, in Metro Vancouver, in Nanaimo have confidence that they won't be hit with escalating costs to produce, knowing that they'll end up producing supply that will not be actually ever purchased because the cost will be too much. And it's critical that we monitor vacancy rates. It's absolutely crucial in these meetings that happen with mayors annually that vacancy rates are monitored, because if we move to suddenly the removal, Honourable Speaker, of no rental clauses, and we see, for example, the sudden construction of thousands of units on university campus for students, we might see an increase in rental rates such that you can't rent your property. And so it would seem unduly punitive if you're paying a tax for not being able to rent a property because there is no demand for it. Again, the critical aspect of this is monitoring in an ongoing fashion. The enabling legislation does allow for timely order in council responses to this, which again is important and something that we felt was important to communicate. So it's critical that while we seek to improve affordability for British Columbians, we take the steps we should do. We ensure that in doing so, we take steps to do so responsibly and avoiding a significant market downturn. With that, Honourable Speaker, I'll say, while again coming back to the overall summary of this, this is not something we would have done. I will give government credit for listening in many areas we brought to government. I think we have to get a little bit closer with these 3 amendments. I recognize it's not exactly what we would have done. I recognize that members from the opposition may have gone farther, but I think at this juncture, this bill, as amended, will be something that the BC Green Caucus will be support and will be watching carefully as we move forward. Thank you, Honourable Speaker.